Hello, we're back with HBO's Rome drama series, and this time we're looking at episode 9, which is called Utica, or Uticensis, and it begins with the aftermath of the Battle of Thapsus, and there's a dead elephant there to make the point that the Pompeian army had used elephants against Caesar's army, though it hadn't worked. Caesar's army had routed them, destroyed them. You have Metellus Scipio and Cato talking about this. I mean, again, it's a little bit staged, because why, the dead elephants were presumably on the battlefield, not during the course of the retreat. And it's the last we see of these two. They go off to Utica. Cato will take the name Uticensis because this is where he dies. It's simplified a lot. The real story is that he doesn't seem to have taken part in the battle. He wasn't really a military man at all, and has generally stayed away. He's been there, he's been trying to sort of govern and arrange the support for the army. Hearing the news, Cato despairs and tries to kill himself. His son and attendants find him. He's stabbed himself in the stomach, but he hasn't died. They call in a surgeon. The surgeon binds up the wounds, and they're first of all watching him. But Cato sort of says, "Well, if you're going to try and stop me killing myself, I can always bang my head against a stone pillar or something like this. You can't do it. It's up to me." When he is left on his own, he tears open the stitches, rips out his entrails, dies in this, appallingly gory, spectacularly gruesome manner that I'm quite surprised they didn't do. I mean, they probably just didn't have time. But given the sort of thing that this is HBO, they like this sort of stuff. In many ways, I'm surprised you didn't have all of this. But the whole point is he will not accept Caesar's clemency. Caesar would have spared him, but Caesar would, however politely he behaved about this, would clearly have loved the fact that he was sparing Cato's life. Cato would have hated every minute of it. It comes down to this idea: Cato will not give in. He will not budge an inch. This is his duty as a Roman. It is the tradition of his family, of Cato the Elder, this stern paragon of Roman virtue, and it's the Stoic influence as well, the philosopher within him. So they rush through this, and as I say, slightly surprised they didn't do the full thing, because even Game of Thrones and the like struggles with inventing this sort of stuff, and it's right up the street of needlessly bloody. However, they didn't do that. You see his funeral, his cremation, and then Scipio gets an officer to kill him and all this thing. Again, the leading Pompeians who survived killed themselves, or in various ways. Afranius and Juba of Numidia stage a gladiatorial combat, and Numidian wins, and then he kills himself. They've decided. Some of them have fought too many times to expect clemency. Others simply cannot contemplate this, that they will. It's not so much that they don't trust Caesar to be merciful, it's just they don't feel it. It fundamentally challenges their idea of what a Roman aristocrat should be, what the Roman state should be, that anyone has the power to grant them this mercy. That's just wrong. So I'm not going to accept that, because that shows that I acknowledge the idea that he has this right, he has this power to do this. That's simply, I'm not going to go that far. So you have this, that's dealt with, and that's really the civil war. I can't remember whether they have much about Munda. There might be a little bit, but it's, as I say, I'm watching these episodes for the first time in a few years, so I've forgotten the details, particularly of these later ones. It tends to be the earlier ones that stick in my mind for some reason. On the whole, this is not an episode where there's a lot for us to talk about in terms of the history, because this is getting very much back into the soap opera elements of the story. We get most of our characters back to Rome. They start to do stuff. Again, very quiet episode for Antony, like the last one. He doesn't really get to do very much, but Octavian returns. He's supposed to have been sent off for safety. It's not true. It's all invented, but he comes back, so you get him. He's skipped an episode or two, and it's Pullo and Varenus going home, Varenus getting the great welcome from his family, Pullo feeling left out, looking for love with his slave girl, all this sort of stuff, building up into other plot lines, the confrontation between Varenus and the local gangster, the local mobster, that we've had that contact before. So we're back to the things that, for me personally, I'm less fond of, I'm less interested in. I like the politics, I like the very Roman stuff. This is you know, the Italians are the Romans are Italians, therefore they're mafia sort of thing. That's the world we're dealing with, and it goes that way. You know, Erastes Fulman or whatever he's called appears. It's all done very well. It's all very menacing, and this confrontation, that sort of thing. But that will build up towards later plot developments where he does, you know, wreaks his terrible revenge and all this sort of thing. You have Brutus. Again, it's I talked about this in other videos on other episodes. Brutus comes across as driven by Servilia. Now, she was clearly a formidable woman with great ambition for her son and for, you know, her husband. Because the story has this huge break between Servilia and Caesar, she's cursed him, all this sort of thing. They play it out as she hates Caesar, though, you know, she has to see him in this case, but they're rather cold to each other. Caesar's cold to her. As far as we can tell, all the sources suggest that their affair is maintained right to the end of their lives. So whether or not they're actively lovers anymore, they are certainly fond of each other. Caesar treats her with great affection. So you have, for instance, the gift of a pearl of great value to her. You have sale of property in auctions of stuff confiscated from dead Pompeians. Servilia does very well. You have, which again is one of those things that they don't do in the story, because of the way they've chosen who they've got as characters and not wanting to complicate things. You don't get Junia Tertia, Brutus's sister, who's married to Cassius, and the story that Caesar has an affair with her as well, that it might even be arranged by Servilia, and that when she gets, you know, buys this stuff up very cheaply, it's, as Cicero is supposed to have joked, well, you know, you don't know the half, but she's getting a third off. Junia Tertia, Junior the Third. You know, Caesar's basically been sleeping with her, and that means he's even more well disposed towards her mother and generous towards the family. Brutus is sent to govern Cisalpine Gaul by Caesar in this period. So, you know, he's marked down to be praetor for 44. There's a little bit where he says, Caesar has been very kind to me. I can't return that kindness by hating him by active opposition. I've got to be nice to him by lack of friendship. Again, another character that's a shame they don't have is Porcia, the daughter of Cato, who's been married to Bibulus, Caesar's fellow consul in 59, and one of the, you know, most bitter opponents of Caesar, who's died during the Civil War. Brutus marries her. So he's marrying a cousin, or, you know, at least the child of his mother's half-brother. Presumably that's still a cousin. I'm not sure if there's some specific notation of what degree that would be. Which is unusual, but not unheard of in Roman aristocratic society. You know, it's fairly unusual, but you're probably married to a cousin at some degree almost all the time, because those main families keep intermarrying. But nevertheless, it's fairly odd. And she is the driving force, perhaps. She's the one, to remind her, he's embracing very much the public face, the idea of his uncle Cato, who's killed himself so gruesomely rather than accept Caesar's clemency. You know, Brutus writes a book in praise of Cato, talking about his great virtues, his determination, all of this sort of thing. Caesar, who doesn't like this, only responds by writing his own pamphlet, his Anti-Cato, where he writes about all, you know, Cato's bad habits, his drunkenness. Again, there's the idea they've turned him into a philosopher as rather sober. Cato had a reputation as a very hard drinker. His thriftiness becomes greed, avarice, meanness, you know, this sort of thing. Now, on the one hand, writing something as vicious as this reflects badly on Caesar. On the other hand, if that's all that a dictator does when somebody praises your most, you know, one of your most inveterate opponents, is write a pamphlet saying, well, I didn't like him much and I don't think he's worthy of praise, that's, you know, that's not that repressive a regime. So we get hints of that, but Servilia takes on a lot of the Porcia role in that she is driving Brutus on to act against Caesar. She wants vengeance on Caesar. There is no evidence for that at all. In fact, the opposite seems to be true. She supports her son, but the driving force will be Brutus as things develop. But that's later. There's not really much about that in this episode. As I say, it's not really one that lends itself to historical discussion, to context, to any great degree at all. So for a change, I'll actually have a shorter video on this episode. It's about very much this personal, this confrontation between Attia and Servilia indirectly. So you have this weird affair between Servilia and Octavia. Servilia starts trying to use Octavia. She mentions that, this story of Octavia having been locked in a cupboard with Caesar, and Attia thinking that they're lovers, but Octavian just saying no, Caesar was ill, he's helping. It's the epileptic fit we've had in one of the early episodes. That story there playing out, and Servilia wants to know more. Is Caesar really ill? Is he afflicted? Is he cursed by the gods? Is he going to die? All this sort of stuff. And she wants Octavia to get Octavian to tell her the details. This will build into the really very weird incest thread where she sort of convinces Octavia to seduce her brother, who apparently, I know he's keen for this all the time, and it's an assumption. I find it deeply strange. Octavia comes out of this series really badly. I mean, the poor girl, you have sympathy for her because she's used by everybody, but she also does all sorts of things that don't seem to reflect. Bear in mind, she's a mother already at this point. She's got her son Marcellus. Whether her husband is still alive or not, it's not quite sure when the former consul Marcellus actually died. But nevertheless, the presentation of her is 99% fictional. Attia is pretty much 100% fictional. So all of this and the whole relationship, it fits with how the story's set up. It fits with their soap opera element, where it's all becoming about personal emotions, the rivalry between these strong, ambitious, rather ruthless women. And that's the way they wanted to go, and they've rolled all sorts of characters into one, and they've gone for this. But you do feel, you get in political rhetoric, you'll find it in Cicero's speeches, that people get accused of unnatural relations with their sisters. It's just what I was getting. I mean, you'll get it even in the Greek tradition. You have Cimon in Athens. Plutarch's life of him talks about playwrights and others putting in slanders that he'd had an affair with his sister, and that he got her to go and try and talk to Pericles, persuade him to go easy on him at a trial and all this sort of thing. And Pericles jokes about, you're a bit old for this, aren't you, and all this sort of thing. This idea crops up, but it does seem to be just the sort of political abuse you throw at someone, and nobody really takes it that seriously. Obviously, Clodius and his sisters, one of whom might be the Lesbia of Catullus. Again, there's these sorts of accusations, but it really seems improbable. There are none about Octavian and Octavia. There's no tradition at all that suggested anything like this. So I don't know quite what it is. Incest seems to feature rather a lot in some of these historical dramas, like the fantasy stuff. Obviously the Game of Thrones, the big deal there, where the brother and sister were even given their sort of almost romantic death scene. It was all very weird. I don't know why. It doesn't do anything for me, but it seems to be something that writers, if they want to, I think it's this desire to make it seem alien and appalling and shocking, and because everybody knows that this is an actor and actress who are not related to each other, you can still have a sexy scene, and those who like that sort of thing can enjoy that. So it's odd. It's really, really weird. It's one of the things I like least about the series. So for me, it doesn't work. It's just annoying and irritating, and episodes like this feel like padding to a series, but that reflects my interest, which is much more in the history and the politics. Again, if people like this stuff, that's fine. The same will be Attia, when she finds out about this, arranges for Servilia to be ambushed. Her slaves are killed, and she's, some of her hair's cut off, and she's sort of half stripped and pushed into the mud. It's nonsense. This sort of thing, this doesn't happen to aristocratic women in Rome, and the idea of the crowd just sort of standing by and just watching, oh yeah, that's fine, don't worry, not getting involved. The whole question of law and order, policing in Rome, all this sort of thing is something we'll talk about at another time, because it's a big question and it's complicated. There is a strong emphasis on helping out fellow citizens, that basically there isn't a formal police force, so we need to help each other out. We don't just let murders go on, and oh yeah, that's fine, no problem at all. So the actions of Varenus when he stops somebody being threatened and beaten up, which leads to the confrontation, is more plausible for the character as well, obviously. But it's also just that this whole, the Atia is almost entirely, apart from her existence and being Augustus's mother, we know nothing really about her. And it comes back to this whole point, she's a married woman at this point. Marcus Philippus is quite a sober, highly respected, distinguished senator who will feature in the months after Caesar's death as well. These sort of vendettas between women leading to violence. People murder each other rather too readily in the story than is the case, which then slightly softens the fact when they do start killing each other in the civil wars and when there are plots. It makes it all to be, oh, well, that's, it's happening all the time. It isn't. That's what makes these things all the more shocking. So those aspects of it simply don't work for me as a historian, but also I find them a bit tiresome as a story. It's all exaggerated. It's all over the top. So, as I say, there's not history to go on. There aren't things I can talk about. The interesting thing, when Caesar goes to Varenus and asks him to stand for magistrate locally, and then later you see him putting on the toga candidatus, the whitened toga of a candidate. Candidatus means whitened, white. You bleached it as brightly as you could so you would stand out in a crowd, and that marked you out as a man seeking office. We don't get a lot of detail about this and what's going on, but again, it's Caesar intervening, trying to get the state working again, which is part of these months. So there's a lot that little bit is quite nice, and that will lead on to things. Otherwise, this is very much a story, a soap opera episode as I've seen. So other than that, there's not really a lot to say. So we're setting up for things, we're building towards, obviously, this intrigue, Octavia and Octavian and Servilia and Atia, that will lead to how they tell the version of the assassination and all this sort of thing and what's going on there, and the catastrophes that will happen personally to several of our characters at the end of the series, leading us on to the next one. As I say, it doesn't work for me, but this might be the favourite episode for somebody else who likes the series in a different way, and that's fine. All of these things are a matter of taste. For the moment, I don't really think there's any more history we can talk about, and me as drama critic is, you have to do a little bit, because you've got to be fair to the people who are writing, directing, performing this, that they remember the fact they are not doing a straight representation of history in all its details. So yeah, I have to talk about that a bit, because otherwise I don't think I'm being fair and trying to understand why they've deviated from the history as they often do. And sometimes you can understand that this is a reasonable choice. For this, as I say, this is a sort of gangstery soap opera, and with weird sex thrown in as well, and it's all invention. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but and I don't find particularly interesting. Nevertheless, you've had some nice bits, and the thing is with the series that on the basis of the way it's telling the story, it all fits and it all sort of works. It's a taste thing as much as anything. So just because I don't think there's much in the way of history to talk about this time doesn't mean that lots of people won't watch and enjoy this episode. As always, you get some very good performances. You come back to the cast is very good in this series. Pretty much at every level, even some of the minor characters. So, and you have the look. We're back to Rome and its grubby streets and its gaudy paintings. It's so there's a lot still that works for me in it. Anyway, that's it. Episode 9, much shorter this time. I can't remember. I haven't sat down to watch episode 10 yet, so we'll see how it goes. There might be a spate of these shorter ones. If they get really short, I'll put a few episodes together into one video. But anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Because the video on episode 9 was so short, I thought we'd go straight on and do 10, because this is another one where there's quite a lot of story elements without too much history really for us to talk about. This one's entitled Triumph, and that's the centrepiece. They have a single triumph for Julius Caesar over Vercingetorix, and we see the Gallic leader that we've only seen in episode 1 is pulled out of prison and then dressed up and then garroted at the culmination of the triumph. And Vercingetorix was in fact removed from prison and executed. But in reality, Caesar celebrated 4 triumphs. He returned to Rome in about July 46 BC, and then I think the 21st of September was the first of all a triumph over Gaul, then one over Egypt, then one over Pontus, and then most recently over King Juba of North Africa. Tactfully, he was trying to say that the triumph was not over fellow Romans in the Thapsus campaign, people like Metellus Scipio and the like, but over King Juba, their Numidian ally. However, amongst the floats for this part of the procession, or the procession on that day, there were paintings in the traditional way that showed scenes of the successful war, and that may well be of the style that we see on things later like Trajan's Column. That might well be these placards carried in triumph, these paintings were part of the inspiration for that sort of monument. He showed the suicides of leading Pompeians and showed their deaths, so that caused a bit of a stir. Generally speaking, this was a huge moment of celebration. The Senate had decreed 40 days of public thanksgiving. I think they talk about 5 in the episode, but 40 days. Now that's twice as much as Caesar had got for defeating Vercingetorix back in 52 BC. You know, it was genuinely a really big event. So it showed the scale of the tributes, the honours, the rewards that are being given to Caesar at this time. And they were excessive, but then nobody had quite done what he'd done. Pompey had celebrated 3 triumphs, so it probably wasn't a coincidence that Caesar celebrated 4. He would go on to have another one, a 5th, for the Spanish campaign as well, that was blatantly over fellow Romans. I'm not quite sure where they're setting this part of the story. I think they're fairly vague about the chronology, so and I can't remember, because I haven't yet got to watch the last 2 episodes again after all these years, whether or not the Munda campaign gets a mention at all. Broadly speaking, you know, it's a reasonable representation of a Roman triumph within the confines of restrictions of a series like this. I mean, there's some of the flags, I think it's the colouring, but it's and in part it's because of the later use by these cultures. They have a sort of slightly Nazi feel about them. I think it's the black, the red and the gold somehow, or of a sort of pseudo fascist state in some science fiction series or something like that. Now, of course, obviously, Mussolini took the name from the Fasces. Leni Riefenstahl and people like that, and the Nazis were inspired by classical architecture pageantry of Roman success, Roman triumph. So it's a sort of circular thing. It just looked slightly odd. But then we don't know in the main the colours of a lot of the things in this. Generally speaking, modern scene designers, set designers go for more flags than you have direct evidence for with the Romans. But again, it might simply be a question of evidence. You have Caesar being dressed up. I'm not sure about the blood being smeared over his face as part of the sacrifice. Involvement of Octavian, probably not in the triumphs in 46 necessarily, but certainly later on, and in the Latin festival of 44. He was old enough then to have a more public role. He has been made a priest. So, okay, didn't mind that. You were supposed to, the triumph in general, as they sort of hint, is a god for the day. You dress up as one of the old terracotta statues of Jupiter, one of the very early ones, hence the painting the face, this sort of terracotta red, which this mirror. But so that they've done that, which I don't think had been done on screen before. I'm not sure it's quite right, but it's, you know, a reasonable enough interpretation of the way they've gone for it. And they obviously, as with a lot of these things, are trying to make the Romans seem strange, alien, violent, you know, the sacrificial element to it all. Similarly, although Vercingetorix said to have been strangled, presumably this is some tradition going back to very early days of sacrificing an enemy leader. Whether they did it more in this sort of Spanish style garroting, who knows. He's the only leader executed in the 4 triumphs as far as we can tell, and because of him and this incident, there tends to be this assumption that at the end of a Roman triumph you sacrifice an enemy leader. It actually seems to have been pretty rare. Vercingetorix is killed. There's a Jewish leader killed in Vespasian and Titus's triumph for the storming of Jerusalem, the Jewish rebellion, in the 70s AD. But I don't think there are too many other examples. So something we assume as normal actually probably is fairly rare by this point. And it may be, certainly in the case of the Jewish leader who was perceived as a rebel. Vercingetorix, Caesar doesn't tell us this, but Dio tells us stories about him being a favourite of Caesar's and having been promoted by Caesar, which would then make turning against Caesar, rebelling, trying to make himself king of all, leader of all the Gallic tribes, a bigger deal. So whether there's that element of treachery or being a Roman ally who's turned against them, but even then, plenty of people do what from this distance appear to be similar things and don't get executed. King Juba's son was quite young. He marched in the triumph. So did Arsinoe, Cleopatra's sister. Again, doesn't get to figure really in these stories. A bit younger than Cleopatra, so middle to latish teens at this point. She's supposed to have inspired the pity of the crowd. She looked noble but pathetic sort of thing, and this combination of good-looking, charismatic royal who marches along, and of course being female as well. So she goes off. She's effectively imprisoned later on, but she's not executed. So again, this assumption of triumph leads to an execution is almost certainly wrong. It actually seems to have been a rarity, and whether it had ever been a normal thing is very hard to say. There are presumably some routes, in the same way there are routes of gladiatorial combats with sacrifice at funerals and this sort of thing, but we don't fully know the details. Maybe someday I'll do more about triumphs and things more generally, but I think for the moment that gives us enough of a flavour for this episode. Otherwise we start off with honours being voted to Caesar. He gets to have 72 lictors at this point. A consul would have 12, a dictator 24. Caesar's got 3 times as many. I think they have him being voted imperator for 10 years or for life or something like that. I'm not quite sure where they're going with that, whether they're going for the sort of whole emperor thing. Obviously his main powers were as dictator, which was extended for, first of all, 10 years, then for life. The way it's shown as this very reluctant Senate of toadies voting for it, approving it, but gritting their teeth sort of thing, particularly Cicero and Brutus and unanimous votes and all this sort of thing. That's simplifying the story, because you have to remember that a lot of the people in the Senate, some of them supported Caesar during the Civil War. An awful lot more have been put into the Senate and been given promotion by Julius Caesar. And the Senate increases to over 900 members from its normal post-Sullan 600. So there's actually a lot of Caesar partisans there as well. And even some of the others are trying to prove that, oh, well, we may have been enemies before, but thanks very much, I really am very, very grateful. So I think, obviously, from the story point of view, they're building up towards the assassination, so we've got to motivate our Brutus within the story to change his mind, to feel that he's obliged to kill Caesar, even though, he's... like Caesar. Caesar's been kind to him, and in the previous episode he's been saying to his mother, look, I can't, how could I return with hatred the kindness that Caesar's given me? And again, and obviously it's reflected in imperial sources like Velleius Paterculus, the emphasis is on how shocked everybody was that Caesar did spare nearly all of his opponents, and not just that, but promoted them. Brutus is having a nice career under Caesar, as is Cassius, who gets introduced very, very briefly in the story of this episode. So a lot of this is to fit the convenience of the story and to sort of compress everything together. We're obviously building up to the conspiracy, the Ides of March. We won't talk too much about that today. You've got the reappearance of, as I say, the Quintus character, who annoys me much as I like the actor. Cassius makes his first appearance. And Brutus being pressured. You have this pamphlet. It's very, very short. He's suddenly shown, Servilia has written praising Cato, it's put Brutus' name at the bottom, and it's circulated, and everybody's reading it, and Cicero's saying, oh, well done, all this sort of thing. Very bold of you. I didn't have the guts to do that. And Brutus is shocked, discovers his mother's done it, is confronted by Caesar, who talks about this. Now, in truth, Caesar wrote a book praising his late uncle Brutus. Brutus wrote a book praising his late uncle Cato, and this was widely published and done quite openly. Again, you've got to remember Caesar is pushing this whole clemency line very, very strongly and saying, no, I didn't want the civil war, they wanted it, they made me do it, I've only defended my honour, I've done what's good for Rome, I've saved Rome from the faction that had taken control. Caesar's only response to this was to publish his Anti-Cato, a pamphlet which tore apart Cato's character. So inventing this, turning, again, it all comes to the way they've presented Brutus, this sort of very reluctant politician, this rather effete philosopher who's forced to do all these terrible things he doesn't want to do, and despises himself much of the time, even while he's doing them. Doesn't really reflect the man himself. And again, it's another sign that Caesar as dictator is pretty mild, and if your only response to a great praise of a man who's been one of your bitterest opponents, who's killed himself rather than accept your clemency, is to write a book reminding people that, well, Cato was a drunk, Cato was very mean, he was unpleasant, he was just a nasty piece of work, I don't praise him to the skies. That sort of thing. Now, obviously, they want more tension in the story, and I suppose you could argue, well, he may have done that, but obviously this is a difficult time. We'll say much more about the conspiracy when we get on to the next two episodes, and we may end up doing those together, because there's quite a rush of lots of sort of soap opera-y stuff that we don't need to worry about too much in terms of these videos and talking about the history. There'll also be, should already be up, the video for the Ides of March about the assassination and the conspiracy and the plotters in history, straightforward with that thing. So that's already on, should be up on the site, on the channel. So we won't say too much more. Other than that, you've got Pullo freeing his slave Irene, and that's nicely done, that you go and register and it's all sort of properly done. I mean, whether they've got the chap doing the sort of, the post office counter, your number coming out next, sitting there, and the clearly bored functionary who's going through all of this and being patient with people filling in their forms. On the other hand, fine, it gives an idea of the bureaucracy and the record keeping, because being a citizen is important. When you free a slave, if the owner is a citizen, that freed slave becomes a citizen, admittedly with slightly limited rights, but any child of theirs comes through legitimate marriage to another Roman is a Roman with full rights. So it's an important thing, and record keeping is a big part of how the Republic functions. The idea of somebody freeing a slave to marry her, again, is quite common. You'll get this on tombstones. There's the famous one from South Shields of the Regina. And the freed woman and wife is a very common formula. And obviously in the circumstances, freed men and women were expected still to show respect to, even obey their previous owners. So to what extent this was an element of compulsion, that they were forced to marry. On the other hand, you could say that about an awful lot of ancient marriages where quite young girls are married off to older men, and it's arranged by the families, happening at quite low social levels as well as among the aristocracy. Or it might be a genuine romance. I mean, in this case, obviously, it's the misunderstanding of Pullo, who's desperate to feel settled somewhere and fit in, and all this sort of thing, have what Varenus appears to have, and all this sort of thing. So that's quite a nice touch. Varenus canvassing. You have signs on the tombs along the Appian Way trying to stop people from posting placards and posters and slogans for elections, because there were all these minor elected posts, and you get it from Pompey as well, the bakers support so-and-so and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, it's quite a nice touch. He's got the toga candidata, the whitened toga we talked about a little bit last time. So all in all, there's a bit more. There's some nice little touches in this. There's bits where they oversimplify, they exaggerate. It isn't a single triumph. Political situation is probably simplified, and again, because of the characters, the way the conspiracy is presented is artificial, because you have the whole Attia-Servilia rivalry, and they meet and all this sort of thing, and Servilia being forced to watch the triumph and all this sort of thing. Again, as we said as I said in the last episode, a lot of that, and particularly the attack on Servilia and all this sort of thing, those are some of the things I like least about this series and that bother me because they're just historically they don't work. But again, if you're just watching it as a story with a bit of flavour of the past, then maybe that's fine. It's almost up there with I think it's in the second series, isn't it, when Mark Antony beats a senator to death in the Senate House. It's just absurd. This sort of thing didn't happen, couldn't happen. It's not the way the Romans worked. They've gone, I think, a little bit too much for a general lack of restraint rather than this outbursts of violence during the civil wars, but also quite a sort of very restricted, very mannered society in many other respects. But again, those are bigger issues to touch upon. So every now and again there are things in the series I just don't like, but there's still enough. Again, this is a Rome set episode, so we get lots of the really nice presentation of the streets of Rome, the Forum of Rome, in this grubby pre-Augustan found it brick, leave it made of marble stage. So I think that's probably all we need to cover for today. So this will be added on to the previous episode, so we'll cover 2, and we might well, as I say, cover the last 2 in one go as well. Particularly as it'd be nice to complete Series 1, and then we'll take a break before we go to Series 2, because Series 2 is less good. But also it'd be nice to do other things. So, as people have keep asking, yes, I will do I, Claudius. I want to do the Eagle. I'm certainly going to do the Masada mini-series. There are quite a few other things I'd like to look at. Fall of the Roman Empire I've still got to do at some point. It's already in my favourite movies one, but I'd like to do a bit more on that. And some of the other less famous things. There's a few interesting TV series like the Eagle of the Ninth, which is influential for me as a child growing up, and Warrior Queen about Utica, that was, again, I managed to rediscover on video because I'd only seen it when it was out originally, and I think I missed 1 or 2 episodes. Is quite an interesting little take on how Roman Britain worked, how the Roman Empire worked. And so there are a few more out there. There are other things where we'll look at, and we might just look at how the Roman army is presented in other themes as well, some of the biblical epics, that sort of thing, because that can be quite interesting. And we'll certainly do something on the naval battle in Ben-Hur in its various versions, and maybe the chariot race as well. So there's lots more to come. We're getting close to the end of season 1 of Rome, but anyway, hopefully today's had some interesting stuff in it. Thanks for watching.